Um, so we're going to talk about the oncology model and implications for patient access. So what are the good, the bad, and the ugly of the way that that works relative to limited distribution drugs, as an example. The second part will be talking about the key stakeholders, and there are a lot of them. And we all know who they are, but I want to give a point of view in terms of kind of what drives some of the motivations and where we should focus relative to opportunities for change. And then the third is to continue that look at the ongoing evolution of challenges in patient experience. And again, we know what a lot of those things are. Which of those do we think we might be able to influence, and which of those we think will continue to kind of double down relative to creating constraints or barriers to access from a patient perspective. So based upon my backstory, I think it's helpful to talk about the patient cancer experience. Now, I did not do this, but I found it to be super helpful because really what it does, and if you look on the upper right-hand corner there, it says, you know, when someone has received that diagnosis, I really have two different sets of challenges. One is the emotional adjustment that they have to make relative to, one, thinking that they might be dying, or what that journey is going to look like from a family, from a personal impact. And it's just a huge blow to the psyche, as some of you may have experienced directly or indirectly. The second part of that is there's the clinical treatment route. And what does that look like? You know, what am I going to expose myself to, and what is it going to cost me, and what implications will that have from an experience and from a lifestyle perspective? And one thing I forgot to mention was if any of you, I do know that they're sharing the slides and the recordings, but if any of you want this faster than they're going to share it, just give me your card or connect with me on the app or connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to send you an electronic copy today or tomorrow. So I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but basically this is kind of a standard way of looking at the different steps in the process for cancer treatment. And it's not that different than other therapies, except the uniqueness of kind of that therapy starts to emerge in here. But from the point of diagnosis, you can see, based upon patient feedback, what they're dealing with, you know, the kind of the shock and awe of it all as an example. And as you get further into the decisions, not understanding what decisions they have to make or what the implications are, going through treatment, and then potentially having to loop back through that process because it's not working. And continuing on through that all the way through end of treatment and potentially end of life, depending on what the outcome of that might be, and then potential recurrence. Now, this is not, you know, and by the way, I'm not a clinician. I've told people many times, when I'm reincarnated, I will come back as either a pharmacist or a doctor, not a dog or something else, but it will happen. It's just a question of when and what I become when that happens. But it's like other conditions where they're dealing with lots of other parallel conditions, comorbid conditions, and lots of other medications. So previous research, for example, a specialty patient can be on as many as 16 or 18 different drugs. And they can have multiple conditions, some other specialty conditions in combination with cancer, as an example. So this is not in isolation, and it further compounds the problem of understanding and appreciating the situation that they're in, but also providing appropriate care. Now, for those of you that are advocates that have been in this space, you know that quite well. You know that firsthand, and having had those experiences. The system, and I think the system, you know, in quotes, has been talked about in just about every session. While the data is there to indicate that, the process really doesn't support that. And so if you're an island out there, like in my most recent case, a specialty pharmacy, not part of a PBM, you only see what they bring to you. You only see what you reach out to gather. You don't get a comprehensive view of everything that's happening to that patient at that point in time. You have to build that story. And the patient, from their point of view, they have to help rebuild it every time they talk to somebody new. So, you know, it's very challenging from that perspective. And it doesn't help solve any of those big looming questions that the patient faces in that journey. So from a role perspective, there is a lot of organizations and a lot of people that are involved in this. So the way I developed this was to put the care providers, people who actually have direct interaction, kind of a clinical vested interest and a skill set and knowledge and capabilities to support that patient on that inner circle. And so there's always a primary care, and there's an oncologist, maybe other specialists. There's a pharmacy, a traditional, a specialty pharmacy, maybe multiple specialty pharmacies, depending on how the network's set up. And all of those are trying to focus on the patient, but typically there's not much connectivity between them other than the business model that lays on top of it. So the way I think about this is, what are the motivations, or what role do they play? The outer ring typically has the largest financial accountability, right? Because they're managing benefit, as an example, or they're managing the physician network if they're a health system, things like that. There's also a kind of a fiduciary relative to who they're supporting, whether it's a self-funded client that they're working on behalf of, or Medicare, as an example. There's also processes and guidelines and other things that they layer into that inner circle in terms of prior authorization or clinical protocols, things like that. So they drop things into the middle of that circle, but they don't directly provide care unless they happen to own practices. But again, it's the physician, it's the pharmacist that does the actual work. So the lines get muddied relative to who does what, and what lever or who controls what. And as from my own experience looking at specialty pharmacy as an example, oncology pharmacy is being talked about as a potential carve-out from other specialty pharmacy. So plan sponsors in the self-funded space are looking to carve oncology out because they want somebody who's specialized in oncology, not the broad specialty pharmacy or the specialty light pharmacies, as an example. So it's becoming even more challenging as we think about trying to standardize. The players start to get further specialized in how that market looks. Now, this one is an eye chart. I'm not going to go through and read all the detail, but basically it was intended to complement the first chart that I shared with you, and I did not develop this one either. The great thing about it, when you see this, and there's a reference if you want to find the actual copy and be able to print that in a larger font, it's got a key on the left that shows the different stakeholders, and you can see there's an in-home versus in-office. So it brings the caregiver into this. It brings other people who are not in a clinical capacity into the dynamics. And it talks about what they do as the patient progresses through those different phases of their cancer treatment. So that ring that I just showed, or those concentric circles I just showed, now expands beyond that because we've got other people, other services, and other supports that are necessary to make that, create the right environment for and help facilitate that patient moving through that journey. Again, super complicated. For those of you that are in the advocacy space, probably see this, maybe not visually in the way that looks, but see it in terms of how you interact. So this one doesn't have as many words, but I will probably use a lot more words describing this because there's a lot packed into what I prepared for you. One, the drug dynamic from a market perspective. Limited distribution drugs have become a thing, have been a thing for quite some time. So small populations. In fact, you could argue at the origins of specialty pharmacy when HIV medications came to market and it became a small niche apothecary business where those were starting to be channeled through and patients were being referred to those specialized pharmacies. That was a limited distribution thing because not everyone wanted to handle it or could handle it. It's getting much more granular now. So over the last 12 to 18 months, well, actually, I'd say over the last 24 to 36 months, in the oncology space, the oral products that come to market, probably 80% of those are being distributed to 3 pharmacies or less. So there used to be an open market thing like in Humira, an open market product, treating rheumatoid arthritis. The oncology drugs are going much, much narrower and much more granular in terms of who they're choosing to support them because of the unique requirements from a pharma perspective, or it could be because of the small populations that are being managed. Same thing as rare and orphan diseases. So one, you've got a narrowing of the market in terms of who gets access to those drugs. And there's more and more going to 1 or 2, and some of the ones who were 5 pharmacies are now converting down to 2 or potentially even 1. So that market dynamic is not changing, and I would expect that to continue. So if you're in the pharmacy business, you're hoping to get access to limited distribution drugs, you're going to have to work really hard to bring that model forward and start to break way into that particular dynamic that exists in the market. The second part of that is the PBMs control the networks, even on the medical side. Infusion, they control the networks relative to the contracting process. I had, it's kind of an interesting role for me having been at CVS and United Healthcare in having defined the network participation requirements. So now I'm kind of suffering the results of that, right? Being a small independent pharmacy, trying to get into network, in a network that I initially created back, a decade or so ago. It's extremely challenging, but the networks have been narrowed. So not only are there a small number of pharmacies that get access to the drug, but there are a decreasing number of pharmacies that are allowed into these networks. So if you're a patient, you're now at the mercy of the PBM, and you're being told which pharmacy you need to go to, because it's either limited distribution or they have just created an exclusive network with the PBM-owned specialty pharmacy as part of that. One of the dynamics that occurs within that is that the PBMs, and I use the term clawback, you've probably heard that before, but they look for creative ways to bring their patients back or their members back to them so that they're being serviced by their own specialty pharmacy. And I would say if you are in the specialty pharmacy business, that's something you need to watch, because often it's not necessarily something that they're supposed to be doing. So you have to be very careful about that and make sure that you challenge them whenever they start performing like that. Formulary controls has been an issue, continues to be more aggressive, a lot more exclusions, and a lot more hurdles being put in place, which on one side delays, or it limits the choice from a patient perspective. And for those things that don't align from a formulary first tier point of view, or even a second tier, starts to raise the cost from a patient access perspective. The second thing it does is it starts to remove options from a prescriber point of view. So there are funds which you can go to, which have been talked about in just about every session, but doesn't really solve the bigger problem relative to providing access and also doing it in a way that's cost effective. The formulary controls will continue to be leveraged and I think in some cases used as a hammer as a way to solve other problems. And certainly from an exclusion perspective, I think they've doubled over the last several years from the large PBMs just outright driving toward rebate dollars and in exchange for that, removing dozens of additional products on an annual basis from the formulary. Prior authorization criteria and complexities with pathway programs, with other criteria, not to say you still won't get the approval, but the bar is much higher. And that process continues to be very onerous, even though there's pledges to make that automated and try to remove some of that barrier. It is a barrier to access, both in terms of delay and ultimately maybe not ever getting the approval and have to switch to an alternate therapy. And then finally, which is probably the biggest topic in this event, is around financial assistance. It has become such a large challenge from a patient perspective that, there are patients that can't get on their drugs and won't start their therapy because of the financial burden on that. And often will give up at the very first sign of resistance and may not be willing to go through the process of filling out the financial need forms and things like that. So the cost shifting part of that and all the other activities that have happened with the accumulators and things, for example, in the commercial space, continue to create challenges. So the opportunities for change from my perspective, really, I think there's some fundamentals here. One is making sure that you and the people in your organization really do understand the bigger picture of the dynamics in play and what it is that you have to deal with, but also what you can do from a participation standpoint to challenge the process. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is finding creative ways using tools that exist in the market to try to simplify the process, to try to automate the process, to try to take time out of the process. Prior authorization as an example. I don't think there's anyone who doesn't use Cover My Meds because that's required by some payers, but it also helps to facilitate the completion of the prior authorization process. I put in there RX Lightning, an organization that I've worked with in the past that has found creative ways to move beyond the simplicity of a Cover My Meds tool, add other capabilities in there, and it becomes a very easy to use, very rich referral tool. And they have a booth here, and I see Jordan in the 6th row. So, check out the technology. Technology can help solve problems, simplify the day, provide other sources of information, and provide some repeatability in what you do to try to improve that exercise. And there are opportunities for PBMs to participate in that, certainly other players like pharma to be part of that model. And the beauty about this particular one is it's agnostic. So it will support all pharmacies, all drugs, all payers as a tool. The collaboration part of this is a significant upside opportunity. And I think the simple part of that, and I know, again, this is going to be oversimplification, the conversations that happen at this forum and the sharing of information and the sharing of challenges, but also solutions, is ultimately the origin of where a lot of the industry solutions have come from. You know, it's that spark of innovation, it's that leveraging and creation of new best practice. And in some cases, it leads to lobbying, it leads to common solutions that an industry will stand up. Things like moving new standards into NCPDP, as an example, as a way to drive change from a grassroots perspective. So I think that's something, again, as you think about the conversations you're having, is there common belief in a solution or common belief in escalating a problem that can lead to a better outcome? There is a huge dependence on data in this business. Now, part of the challenge, which I referenced earlier, is that typically, if you're in a service provider role, the data you have is the data that you create or the data that comes in on a claim. And if you want more than that, you're going to have to create it yourself. I'm curious if any of you have created interconnectivity, interoperability with EMR, EHR in your business, or know businesses that have done that outside of a health system. And I know health systems are challenged by even integrating amongst themselves because they have multiple platforms and things. Not necessarily that that's the kind of nirvana that you need to search for, because even that has some limitations to it. But the data connectivity part of this can be huge. And one, providing a better source of information for the patient or whoever's providing care for that patient to begin that journey. And certainly the sharing of that information to others as that journey continues forward, and finding ways to leverage that from a care perspective, which you can also then leverage that from a digitization perspective in terms of providing richer insights or understanding more about the patient's experience, which allows you then to think about the way that you want to engage with that patient from a care perspective, even from a basic interaction perspective. There is a model, well, actually it's a concept around maturity, capability maturity. Any of you heard about CMMI? Capability maturity model? No one? Okay. Basically, the concept is that core competency, let's say it's around clinical program development, is something that has stages of sophistication and stages of competency. And the left-hand side, if you think of it as a 5, and I'll go left to right, or right to left, kind of 5 columns of maturity. On the far left-hand side is every day we wake up and we just do what we want to do. So it's all free form. There's no standards. There's no process. There's no program. There's no roadmap to follow. There's memory, but it's not really a repeatable approach. The 5th side, which is the highly mature, is the continuous improvement. So you're optimized. You figured out how to make your business run or your function run as well as it can. In fact, you could be considered the market leader. And you have the capability internally to be able to innovate and continue to drive the advancement of who you are as a business. Part of the issue that we have in the industry is we're lacking in competency in a lot of different areas. And so understanding that what you do today in your business relative to, let's say, data use, relative to clinical management or the processes you have in place, not necessarily to qualify from a URAC perspective, but in terms of the details of how work gets done, the ability to examine that and to critique that and to measure it and to optimize that will get you to that next level. So in the course of doing that, it gives you, one, an opportunity to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the business, but it also, I think, opens up opportunity for you to leverage other data sources. As you get more sophisticated, you become more optimized as a business, which will create better value for you, but also allow you to leverage that to create better experience and better value from a patient perspective. And the last part on here, which seems very simple, is start off with a patient and always keep the patient in mind. I think most organizations do some type of patient feedback relative to patient satisfaction, net promoter score. It seems to be the badge that people are trying to achieve in terms of service delivery, service care, and often that's how you're measured. But you need to think further about that and leveraging the insights that you get from your front line. Talking to your pharmacists, talking to the techs, talking to people who are engaging directly with patients to understand what are the issues that they're experiencing? How do they feel about that last service experience? Some of this can be a paper electronic process, but having that frontline kind of, I would say, focus group conversation will go a long way and really opening up and making that more, I guess, human and personal in that process. The second part of that is from an organization perspective, and I don't question this for this group, but when you're in an organization that has passion for patient care, you see it, you hear it, you know it, it exists. And anytime there's a conversation, the patient is always the first person to be referenced in that conversation. And anything that looks like it might be an implication or an impact to that patient, someone will raise their hand and that'll be the first thing that they raise issue with. From a personal experience, as an example, when you're in business, you get all caught up in the top line, bottom line stuff. And you make a foolish statement like, that was a low margin patient. It doesn't really go where you need to go. So I think that part of it in terms of continue to stay focused on the patient, making sure that you're being thoughtful about that experience, using that as a way to find creative solutions to support the patient. But at the same time, looking at the bigger picture and trying to find ways to integrate across your business and leverage expertise in the market could be super helpful for you.